the witch's familiar features regularly in modern depictions of witches in popular culture. You probably recognize them from such shows as Supernatural, Inside Number 9, or even Sabrina the Teenage Witch, to name just a few. They can either be quite dangerous, or in the case of Sabrina, you've got a very witty and funny black cat. The witch and the familiar is a very enduring image. But what I'm going to talk about today is where this pairing came from. The witch and her familiar in 16th and 17th century England. The familiar I want to talk about was believed to have been a very dangerous entity. It was often understood to be a creature with a very nefarious purpose. It served a witch's will. It harmed her enemies and sometimes acted as an emissary from the devil. So dangerous was this creature, this partner to the witch, that for one to claim to have owned such a creature could lead to your execution. The idea of the witch who used a familiar during this time was a person who was believed to have rejected God and aligned themselves with the devil, something you don't want to do in the 16th or 17th century, for sure. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some particular familiars and show you the role that they played in bringing the witch into the world of the devil and helping her to harm her victims. These are stories that were told in very stressful situations. They were taken from accounts of confessions and accusations taken in the build-up to a witchcraft trial. They were told by desperate people, whether they were people who were confessing to these acts or whether they were accusing another person. Both of these groups were in a very difficult place. I'm going to start off with my personal favourite familiar. This is a little cat called Satan. Now, Satan the cat featured in the accusations levelled against Elizabeth Frances back in 1566. Through her confessions that she gave at this trial, and in a separate one over a decade later, Elizabeth talked about how her relationship with familiars had helped her to kind of shape her relationships, harm her enemies, and ultimately lead to her death. When Elizabeth was only 12 years old, she claimed, her grandmother taught her how to become a witch. She was taught to renounce God and to give her blood to Satan, the cat. Elizabeth was told that she should care for her demonic cat, which included feeding him bread and milk, calling him Satan, because he was very particular about this, and keeping him in a basket, a very demonic location. The grandmother died at some point before Elizabeth was tried for witchcraft. By this point, she had passed on her reputation for witchcraft onto her granddaughter. Satan the cat served a very important purpose, for through him, Elizabeth could seek out her desires and cause harm. He always required payment from Elizabeth in the form of a drop of blood, which she provided by just pricking herself and then passing the blood on to him. Her requests began as very simple for Satan. She started off asking for riches and goods, because you obviously would. And he was happy to oblige, but wanted a bit more detail. And so Elizabeth asked for some sheep. Satan returned with 18 black and white sheep, but unfortunately, they soon wearied and died. Elizabeth upped her requests. She asked the cat to make Andrew Biles, who was a local man who had gained her attentions, especially because he was quite well off, her husband. Satan was happy to oblige, but said that she must first have sex with Andrew before marriage. Elizabeth agreed, but unfortunately, Andrew didn't. And after they had slept together, he left. Now, Elizabeth then found out that she was very angry about this, and so sent Satan to destroy his belongings. But she had a much stronger desire for vengeance, and this wasn't enough to satisfy that. And so she then sent her cat to kill him. After Andrew had died, she discovered that she might be pregnant with his child, and not wanting to have the baby, she then sent Satan out to get her some herbs, and she used these herbs to make a drink to end the pregnancy. So you would have thought she might have learnt that Satan's offerings often lead to ill, but no, Elizabeth doesn't learn a lesson here. She then decides to send Satan out to get her another husband, a Christopher Francis. Christopher wasn't as rich as Andrew, but Satan was happy to oblige, again on the proviso that she had sex with him before marriage. Now, this time she was lucky and Christopher agreed to marry her. And 3 months after they eventually married, she gave birth to her daughter. So, yeah, there was a bit of a gap. Elizabeth then, unfortunately, became very unhappy in her marriage, and particularly with her daughter. And so when she was only 6 months old, Elizabeth sent Satan to kill her daughter. This, however, didn't make her marriage any better, and understandably, and she then said to Satan, "Can you make my husband's leg lame?" Satan achieved this act by turning into a little frog, sitting into her husband's shoe, and when the husband put the shoe on, he touched the frog with his foot. He was very concerned. What is this creature in my shoe? And Elizabeth just told him, "It's fine, just kill it." But after that, he suffered with a lameness in his leg from which he never healed. So after 15 or 16 years of owning this delightful cat, Elizabeth became very wary of its presence in her life. She decided to gift the cat to another woman, an Agnes Waterhouse. In exchange for some cake, Elizabeth taught Agnes to feed the familiar, call it Satan, and to definitely give it some blood. Elizabeth actually managed to survive this particular set of accusations, but was eventually executed in 1579 following a separate trial. In this separate trial, her demonic cat Satan didn't feature. Obviously, that had moved on to another witch, but her reputation for using familiars continued, and she couldn't escape what this was doing for her kind of reputation among her neighbours. And this time, a little dog was able to help her. So in this second trial, and here is this little dog. This is not my drawing, this is from the pamphlet. Elizabeth described how she had one day gone out to ask her neighbours for some yeast. Her neighbours had denied her any yeast. This is quite typical of witchcraft trials, kind of asking for something and being denied. But then Elizabeth was very upset. She was walking home and just wishing that somebody would cause some kind of mischief to fall upon her unpleasant neighbours, and then she heard a really loud noise, and a small dog appeared before her. The dog asked what was wrong, because this is a talking dog, and she said that she wanted him to go and cause some harm to those who had denied her. So Elizabeth gave this dog some bread, and in exchange, she got to cause a little bit of mayhem. So this dog is actually completely less dramatic than Satan the cat back in 1566, but unfortunately for Elizabeth, this was enough to secure her execution, and she was executed after this trial. So 9 years on from Elizabeth Frances, I'm going to tell you about another witch, this time Joan Cason of Faversham in Kent. So Joan had a rat familiar, but this was no ordinary demonic familiar, if any familiar is quite ordinary. For Joan claimed that this rat was the spirit of her dead master and lover, Mr. Mason. We don't obviously get a very traditional meeting narrative here. She doesn't meet her familiar like Elizabeth did, either by being gifted it or kind of it appearing when she was desperate, but instead she knew this familiar when it was a man. So to add to this quite emotional backdrop, she also met this Mr. Mason in rat form for the first time when her husband was dying on his sickbed. And Mr. Mason the rat told her that she should make sure that his will is fulfilled. So he had left his last will and testament and she was meant to deal with it, and she hadn't. So naturally, Joan's accusers didn't actually talk much about this very bizarre man-rat. Instead, they spoke about their own encounters with a rat familiar in a much more typical way. So when witnesses generally encountered familiars, they were on their sick beds, they weren't feeling well, and they're quite near a sleep state. And we get this with Joan's accusers. So one gentleman, Robert Cowper, recounted how one day he had heard a strange noise while lying sick in his bed, and he eventually came to believe this was caused by a rat. He found the rat, cornered it, and tried to kill it with a kitchen utensil. But the rat escaped. Another neighbour, Catherine Kenwood, described an incident where she found a cat lying sick on her sick daughter's neck. And although this is a cat and not a rat, it was considered to be the same creature. As we've seen with Satan the cat, they could shapeshift. So the familiar was a very central part of Joan's witchcraft trial, although the primary accusations levelled against her were that she had bewitched to death the 3-year-old child Jane Cook. According to her accusers, the rat's familiar had helped her in this bewitchment. But she confessed that she hadn't killed this child, but she did know the familiar. She was found guilty of this because of her familiar and not because she was considered to have killed any child. And the mayor told Joan that she should take this opportunity to serve God better and to be a better neighbour. A brief spell in the pillory would have been all Joan would have had to suffer if it wasn't for the fact that a very unhelpful lawyer sat near the mayor decided this was a great opportunity to stand up and let everyone know that actually the invocation of a wicked spirit, so that's the legal terminology for using a familiar, was actually a felony punishable by death. So this rat, this Mr. Mason, who had returned to his lover just to, in part, ensure that his will had been fulfilled, was a deciding factor in sealing Joan's fate. Joan was, unfortunately, executed for witchcraft, but her neighbours did come to regret the part that they played in leading to her death. So moving on from Joan, a few years later, in 1589, we've got our next witch, Joan Prentice. Joan met her familiar one day 6 years before her trial. It was around this time of year at 10 o'clock at night. Joan was sitting in her chamber at an almshouse, and she was preparing for bed. Before her appeared the devil in the shape and form of a greyish ferret. It had very fiery eyes, so it was definitely demonic. The ferret stood with its hind legs upon the ground and its front paws on her lap, staring into her eyes. The creature spoke to her, saying, "Joan Prentice, give me thy soul, which I must have before I will depart from thee." Joan told the ferret quite reasonably that she couldn't give him his soul because Jesus Christ owned it, because he had earned it through the shedding of his blood. The ferret, however, was not one to let the matter drop, and so responded by saying, "I must then have some of your blood." And Joan was perfectly happy to comply. So Joan offered this ferret the forefinger on her left hand, which the creature took into his mouth, and placing his front paws on her hand as well, and he sucked the blood from her finger, which apparently, according to Joan, and unsurprisingly, did smart exceedingly. After this exchange, Joan asked the creature's name, and he introduced himself as Bid. So a month later, Bid the ferret returned again. Joan was preparing for bed and sitting on her stool. The ferret asked her if she would go to bed, and she stated that she will by God's grace, so she's clearly not ready to turn her back on God just yet. The scene that was described at this second meeting is the one depicted just here, not the witches in the background and the familiars frolicking, but the lady on the stool. So that's Joan with her ferret. So Bid jumped onto her lap, reached past her breast and onto her left shoulder, and then declared to Joan, after sucking her left cheek, that if you will have me do anything for you, I am and will always be ready at your command. And this was a perfect opportunity for Joan, because she had only just fallen out with the wife of a William Adams. So she asked Bid, the ferret, to go and spoil the drink that the wife was currently brewing. This exchange became very much the staple of their relationship, with Bid appearing at night, sucking Joan's cheek, and then going away to cause some mayhem. Whenever Joan wanted to summon her ferret at another occasion when he hadn't turned up, she gives us the kind of rhyme that she says to kind of attract him. So she would say, "Bid, bid, bid. Come bid, come bid, come bid. Come suck, come suck, come suck. and then he would appear and suck her left cheek, and it's probably one that you could try at home if you wanted. So their final act of mischief together occurred when Joan sent her ferret to the house of a Master Glascock to nip, but not hurt, one of his children named Sarah. Bid, however, didn't follow Joan's directions explicitly, and when he returned the next night, he told Joan that he had nipped Sarah and that she would soon die. Horrified, Joan declared, "Thou villain, what have you done? I bid you just to nip it a little and not hurt it, and you have killed the child." So after this exchange, Bid, not being very much appreciated, disappeared and never returned. So Joan here was clearly trying to show herself in as godly a light as possible. She wouldn't give her soul to the devil, and she didn't want to cause any long-lasting harm through her relationship with the ferret. But nevertheless, her relationship with Bid was central to her ability to cause harm via witchcraft, and so was pretty much instrumental in her eventual execution. So now I'm going to jump forward a few years to 1645, and Matthew Hopkins, which is available, I believe, in the foyer as a tea towel, and through him, Elizabeth Clark. So you might be familiar with Matthew Hopkins. He's the self-appointed witchfinder general who, along with his associate John Stern, helped to run the East Anglian witch hunt of 1645-7. He was also famously portrayed by Vincent Price in the 1960s folk horror classic Witchfinder General. Probably one of the most well-known groups of witches, thanks largely to his pamphlet, A Discovery of Witches, were the ones who surrounded Elizabeth Clark, and most particularly her familiars. Elizabeth was reported to Matthew as a possible witch, and so was kept awake for a few nights in an attempt to get her to confess to her crimes. He wasn't allowed to torture people, but apparently sleep deprivation for 3 or 4 nights is fine. And then following this very grueling exercise, Elizabeth began to call her familiars into the room, so this was on the 4th night. Matthew described what he saw before him. First, there was Holt, who was just a little white kitten. Next, there was Jamara, who was described as a fat spaniel without any legs. Elizabeth explained that she kept him fat on purpose and would smack her belly in order to get him to jump up and drink her blood. Next, we have my personal favourite, Vinegar Tom. He was described as a long-legged greyhound with a head like an ox, very broad eyes, and a long tail. Matthew further claimed that this dog transformed before them into a 4-year-old child without a head, ran around the house 6 times, and then left out the front door. So he sounds reliable. Next, we have Sack and Sugar. This was described less dramatically as just a black rabbit. And then we have News, who was described as a polecat. Elizabeth also gave names of other familiars, of which she was aware of, such as Elemanza, Pyewacket, Peck in the Crown, and Grizzle Greedygut. So these are all very exciting and bizarre names, and quite strange creatures. These descriptions all come from the 1647 published work that Matthew wrote on the East Anglian hunt. He wrote this at a time that he was starting to have to defend the actions that he had taken. But if we look at accounts that he gave back at the time, back in 1645, then we see something a little less bizarre. Jamara, the legless spaniel, was merely just a very plump dog. Vinegar Tom was just a long-legged greyhound. He didn't have an ox-like head, and he definitely didn't turn into a headless child. The others were just described as a black imp, and another one was merely called a polecat. They're a lot less exciting than the familiars that Matthew would come to describe 2 years later. But Matthew wasn't the only one to describe this parade of familiars before the witch hunters, at least. John Stern claimed that Elizabeth had threatened him with one of the familiars, in particular with Sack and Sugar, the black rabbit. Elizabeth had told John that he was very lucky that he was so quick. Otherwise, sack and sugar would have jumped onto his head, entered into his throat, and turned into toads in his belly. John further claimed that Matthew had spoken to Elizabeth and asked her whether that she was concerned that they would harm them, the familiars would harm those present. And Elizabeth said, "What? Do you think I'm afraid of my children?" Yet Elizabeth herself claimed that she had been pushed into using the familiars, claiming that Satan would never let her be at rest or quiet until she'd consented to the killing of the hogs of a Mr. Edwards of Manningtree and the horse of a Robert Taylor. Elizabeth may have attempted to show herself in as positive a light as possible through this statement, but another accused witch, Anne Leach, gave a bit more to her examiners than Elizabeth was willing to do. Anne claimed that herself, Elizabeth Clark, and a third witch, Elizabeth Gooding, had willingly sent their familiars out to kill some of the horses and cows that belonged to their neighbours. In a group meeting of witches, another accused witch, Rebecca West, claimed that Elizabeth had sent her familiar out to scare a horse belonging to Mr. Edwards, and it had the intention of causing the horse to unseat the rider with the hopes that it would kill the gentleman who was riding it. Elizabeth herself was also said to have given her interrogators some helpful information in hunting down other witches. She confessed, according to John Stern, that anyone who had the types of marks on her body that she had almost certainly owned familiars, and were therefore witches. These marks are often referred to as witches' marks, and it was a topic that John Stern was keenly interested in because they acted as physical proof of witchcraft. So how did these familiars, or any of the familiars she's described, come into her life? Well, according to Elizabeth, Anne West, a widow who she knew, had taken pity upon her one day when she was out in a field collecting sticks. Due to both her poverty, hence the stick collecting, and because she only had one leg, Anne decided to send her a thing described as like a kitten, which was then followed by a second kitten familiar. These cats told Elizabeth, because they can speak, that they wouldn't hurt her, but they would help her find a husband, and thus she would be much better maintained and no longer would have to suffer in poverty. But just to complicate matters, another account was printed around the same time that probably also refers to Elizabeth, but by an alias of Benefield. Here we get an incredibly unusual version of how one could feasibly meet their familiar, because in this account, Elizabeth was said to have given birth to 6 kitten familiars, which she had by as handsome a man as any was in England. So this was the devil. And afterwards, you can understand why this story might have occurred, because she did call her familiars her children, and so there was a literal account somewhere that cropped up. So as you can no doubt see from these gifted or birthed cats and Matthew's increasingly dramatic descriptions of the familiars, you can never take these accounts at face value. But what they do tell us, at least, is the types of ideas that were being spread about familiars during the height of witch hunting in England. All these examples I've given so far make it seem like men didn't have familiars, but that isn't true at all. It's just these stories largely come from pamphlets, and these pamphlets tend to favour the narratives of women witches. But I've got a few male witches I want to quickly go over in the last 5 minutes, just to give you an idea of what they were thought to be capable of doing. So first is John Scarfe of Rattlesden in Suffolk. In 1645, he claimed that he attempted to gain a familiar by a pretty direct fashion. So one day he found a rat in his house and decided to keep it in a box. He would then put the box on his stomach in order to get the rat to suckle him. So I wouldn't advise following his directions. Another man, Peter Buckbush of Ely in Cambridgeshire, told his neighbour, Henry Thorne, how any man was able to become a witch. All it took was for one to keep the bread when presented it at church and drink the wine, that's fine. And then when you leave, you just need to press against the church wall, and before you will appear a toad or frog. It will have its mouth gaping open, and you just pop the bread in there. And then afterwards, you have a witch, presumably because you've got yourself a familiar, and you've also committed an act of religious desecration, so that's 2 for 2. Male witches could also use their familiars in ways that were quite typical of their female counterparts. John Bysack of Waldingfield Magna in Suffolk is one of my personal favourites of this type. He had 6 snail familiars. They were named Sidrake, Geoffrey, Peter, Aylward, Sackar, and Pieman, and they each specialised in attacking a different type of target. So the first snail would kill all manner of fowls, and the second would kill sheep. The third would go after hogs and similar, and the fourth would go for cows. The fifth attacked horses, and the sixth, Christians. Which doesn't seem like a very fair distribution of the workload, but these must have been very menacing snails, but unfortunately, I don't have an image of them. So, what do these witches and their familiars tell us about how these creatures were understood in the 16th and 17th centuries? They seem to have given power to those who lacked it. We can never know the true extent to which those who confess to owning these creatures really believed what they were saying. We understand today that the interrogation process, even without torture, can be pretty arduous and lead to false confessions. Though some who confessed to owning these creatures gave very elaborate stories about their relationships and how they used these creatures to cause harm, not all accused witches admitted to using familiars, and they would deny that they had any knowledge of these creatures. But what of those people who feared the familiar? What was it to them? It can certainly seem like a very intrusive animal. It was associated with a known or suspected witch, and it appeared at the same time as a very traumatic life event, whether that's loss of livelihood, sickness, or death. A witch and a familiar was able to cause harm even when the witch herself was not physically present, because the familiar could reach into the homes of the victims because of its diminutive size paired with its diabolic nature. It's hardly surprising today when a neighbour's cat manages to get into our homes. But since the familiar was often the size of a cat or even smaller, say a mouse or one of John's snails, then how could one feasibly stop it? I've told you about how one of Joan Cayson's accusers attempted to kill her rat familiar, and he wasn't the only one to have reacted so violently to the presence of this familiar in the house. Other people tried to throw them like a rat onto a fire, and another familiar, a cat, was beaten on the head with a pike. The cat was then put into a sack and thrown under the stairs, but the cat disappeared, so it was fine. Such attacks, however, were more often than not doomed to failure, because the familiar wasn't really a normal animal. It could change shape. It could sneak out, and it could just replicate itself into different forms, so you couldn't really kill a familiar. To its early modern victims, the powers and abilities of the familiar partnered with the emotions of desires and emotions of a witch who had turned against God represented a very dangerous threat. It was something to be avoided, attacked, and, most importantly, feared. For an accused witch, however, the familiar was possibly even more dangerous, because not only could it lead to their execution, but in the 16th and 17th centuries, it could condemn their very immortal soul to the devil. Thank you.